Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining the 30-second webinar in our Pandemics and Society series. Today's topic is the state of U.S. biodefense. I'll now pass it to our moderator, Jennifer Nuzzo, Director of the Pandemic Center at Brown University School of Public Health. Jennifer?
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion. So as we convene today, I think it's a clear argument that one could make that biological risks are on the rise. Lots of reasons for that. If we look at the risk of a natural pandemic, there have been some calculations estimating that there may be a 35% probability in any given decade that there'd be a fairly serious respiratory pandemic. If you extend that over 25-year period, maybe a 66% probability. I think you can debate these calculations, but just to say that there is a fairly decent bet that there is going to be another major pandemic, possibly in the not too distant future. Of course, that's not the only threat we worry about when we talk about biological threats. There's also the risk of a deliberate or accidental biological event. And with new tools like artificial intelligence, machine learning, it may be making it easier to access biotechnology and possibly to create novel pathogens that could result in scenarios far worse than anything we have seen to date. Of course, we also know that these very same technologies simultaneously are making it easier to counter these threats by enhancing our capacity to develop, manufacture, and deliver medical countermeasures like vaccines, tests, treatments, personal protective equipment. Some exciting progress is at the 100 Days mission, which is essentially the world's challenge of trying to develop a medical countermeasure within 100 days of the emergence of a new pathogen, has made significant progress, and we've really never been closer to that goal than we are now. But there are also uncertainties, particularly with changes in policy and funding decisions, particularly those coming out of the United States. So we thought it was an appropriate time, given this changing risk space, changing preparedness space, changing defense space, to have a conversation about where we are. We recently had a State of the Union address, and let's have a state of the biodefense situation. And so we have a great panel lined up here today to inform us about where we are with respect to capabilities to protect the nation and the globe against biological threats. Traditionally, this is focused within government agencies, but over the years, other sectors, non-governmental sectors have also played an important role. So where do we stand? I'm going to just dive into the conversation, and I'm very pleased to introduce our panel. First, I'm to be joined by Beth Cameron, who is Senior Advisor to the Pandemic Center here at the Brown University School of Public Health, and she's also Professor of the Practice. Beth has held many, many positions and worked at the highest levels of biosecurity and biodefense, including serving as Special Assistant to the President on the White House National Security Council staff. And she twice helped establish and lead the National Security Council's Directorate on Global Health Security and Biodefense, a role that she served in under 3 presidents. And I'm also happy to welcome Kelly Chafin, who serves as the Head of Response and Federal Strategy at Secure Bio. She is also the former Director for Biodefense at the National Security Council and former Chief of Chemical and Biological Issues at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And then rounding out our panel, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Harshini Mukundan, who is lead for chemical and biological technologies, as well as senior scientist and department head for bioengineering and biomedical sciences at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And as you'll see by her background, has a lot to say on the science, which is really exciting and rapidly evolving. So thank you all for joining today, and let's just get into it. We're going to have a kind of moderated discussion, which I, as moderator, I'm going to take the prerogative of kickstarting, but encourage those who are participating in this webinar to use the Q&A function to put your questions in. We definitely want to save time for questions from our audience. Let's just start the conversation by kind of setting some common expectations. I'd love to hear from you all. This topic is about biodefense. What does that term mean to you? It is obviously a term that's been around for a while. There's been a lot of effort over the many, many decades, but there have been some evolution, and people may be coming to this topic new. They may not even know what that term means, or they may be coming to it with a definition that perhaps is a newer interpretation of it. So I'd love to hear just from the 3 of you Um, and I'll leave it to whoever wants to kick it off first. Tarsha, you're already off mute, so I'm going to call on you.
All right, I'll go first.
Okay.
So I think biodefense is, to me, very simple. It's just defending against biology. And that could be, defending against natural, it could be defending against, other actors or players that might be involved. And all of that comes in one ensemble because as a scientist, the way that I view what we need to do to look at and prepare for especially unanticipated threats is very common across the board. In my own career, biodefense has been building an arsenal of tools to both anticipate and respond to threats, which could be again natural or otherwise, but that has applied to supporting global health programs and across the world, but it's also helped for national security type of applications. And that ensemble is how I view biodefense.
Yeah, I would just come in and say I agree with that, Harshi. And I think there's lots of terms out there. There's biodefense, biosecurity, global health security, and then pieces of that we'll get into later, like biosurveillance or disease surveillance and response. And I would just say that looking back over the past several administrations, so my career spans back to the George W. Bush administration, and the biodefense strategy in that administration was built on in the Obama administration, was built on in the first Trump administration, was built on in the Biden administration. And a fairly common landscape there is what Harshi described as looking at naturally occurring, accidentally released, or the result of a deliberate biological attack. And it's the actions that the United States needs to take to be ready for all three of those scenarios. In the last biodefense strategy that the U.S. put out, which many of us worked on in different different shapes and forms, and which got kicked off in 2021 when I was at the White House in the Biden administration, but Billy built on the Trump administration before. We defined biodefense as actions to counter biological threats, reduce biological risks, and prepare for, respond to, and recover from biological incidents, regardless of origin. And the definition goes on. But we did add one other thing that I think is important and interesting to think about here. We introduced this term nationally or internationally significant biological incidents. And what that implies is that biodefense is about defending our nation and the world, working with partners against incidents that can cross borders and really cause large scale harm. And maybe the last thing I'll say here is this has really been a bipartisan issue for decades, and that's something that I think we need to continue to build upon and really infuse more of into the discussion, because this is really about protecting our nation, saving lives, being ready to attribute if we're talking about a deliberate attack, and helping partners stop outbreaks at the source.
Kelly.
I think all the points that have been made already, I would absolutely agree with, and just underscore again that biodefense doesn't necessarily come with the connotation of an intentional biological threat. I hear that quite often, and I really view it in a lot of ways as interchangeable with another common term, a catch-all term of biosecurity. Lowercase biosecurity, not capital biosecurity, meaning biosafety, biosecurity. So just again, underscore when you hear biodefense, think biosecurity, all hazards, all biological hazards, excuse me, and just agree with what my colleagues have said.
Yeah, thank you for that, for underscoring the how it arose question is often very difficult to tell. And in the beginning, you just simply don't know. And so, being prepared for a range of potential scenarios, I think, is fundamental to it. Um, Maybe just a permutation of this question, because for many people, I know from experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, for many people, the fact that preparedness for a pandemic was even something that people thought about was just stunning. In fact, some people found the fact that people were thinking about it in advance as suspicious, because we were dealing with this. To them, it seemed like an unprecedented scenario, and in many ways, in modern times, it was. But the fact that there was an effort to plan for such scenarios seemed just, too coincidental to be for good purposes. But and not all of you have to address this, but if someone wants to just kind of chime in and just talk about, like, this is an area of work that's not new. It is an area of work that's gone on for a while. It's an area that's had to accommodate a changing threat space. Just if anybody wants to summarize that for people who might be tuning into this conversation, for whom this term, these ideas are the first time they've heard it, just to give us a sense of like where we've been and where we are today.
Well, I can start it out with a little bit of a science perspective, if that helps. COVID-19 was neither the first pandemic, nor will it be the last one to hit our shores. Historically, there's been pandemics, at least routinely about every 100 years or so. The 1918 influenza was the last time, so we're a little bit overdue. The reason some of these pandemics are a little bit more sparse right now is because of a lot of the efforts that have gone into identify, to protect, to kind of help people to deal with them in some extent. Even with COVID-19, we had the SARS outbreak and then we had the MERS outbreak, and so coronavirus has been threatening to sort of come out and cause an outbreak for a while. So a lot of us have been thinking about the pandemic preparedness, outbreak preparedness. To me, in some ways, the annual influenza cycle, which is going to be a new serotype of influenza that comes out, is an exercise in itself in this regard, because it's an endemic, it's an outbreak, but it could grow into a pandemic. That's what the 1918 flu was. And so this is a routine occurrence that does happen in nature because of the continuous evolution and adaptability of microbes and pathogens that are also trying to coexist along with us in many ways. And so a lot of us, the community, has been thinking about these type of challenges for a long time, which is what helped us address some of these challenges, some of which were averted, actually, historically speaking, successfully to some extent. So because of the efforts of a lot of people looking at it continuously.
And Jen, maybe I'll just jump in and just say a little bit on the deliberate side, more specifically, and from the policy perspective, and some of the things that were put forward. So at the beginning of my career, I entered the State Department in 2003 after not only September 11th, but also the anthrax attacks that happened a month later in the United States. And there was a lot of focus on building capacity to be ready for a bioterrorism event. There was a lot of concern about terrorists and their potential interest in chemical and biological weapons, as well as WMD, weapons of mass destruction more generally. And so there was a lot of planning that happened in that time frame. There was also the uncovering of some of the large-scale aspects of the former Soviet Union biological weapons program, large-scale anthrax production facility in Stepnogorsk that the U.S. government, working under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, the Nunn-Lugar program, the Department of Defense worked with the government of Kazakhstan to get rid of that facility. But finding those facilities and realizing how massive they were also impacted our preparedness platform. We were looking really at state-based threats and terrorist-based threats. And then, of course, during the Obama administration, there were naturally occurring events like the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, but just watching an epidemic that didn't have the capacity to affect every nation on earth necessarily, but really spread in ways that we hadn't seen Ebola really spread in places where political instability was a real possibility. And of course, cases coming to the United States. And that also continued the interest in being ready for surprise. And maybe the last thing I'll say is during that time frame, we also saw dual-use research take a big leap forward, the ability to make pathogens that were more transmissible and more virulent, and also the ability to synthesize for the first time viruses from scratch and to modify them to potentially evade countermeasures that we have, like vaccines. Of course, that is now much easier to do with artificial intelligence-enabled tools and technologies. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but all of that kept the preparedness going. And then back to Harshi's point on naturally occurring disease, George W. Bush was really focused on H5N1 when the first cases in humans arose in Asia and put forward the first national preparedness plan on pandemic influenza. So there's been a focus for lots of reasons, but I think the point is something happens, policymakers get interested, and then we have this boom and bust cycle, this cycle of panic and neglect. So like keeping that focus going has been challenging, but also, we've all worked on that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could turn to you, Kelly, just to kind of on this next point, which is just that there's clearly been a lot of change over the years. The the types of risks have changed. The technologies that enable risks have changed. And you've served in positions where you've had to see around corners to make sure the country was prepared, not just for the scenarios that have happened in the past, but to envision future scenarios. I would say in public health, people who are trained in public health, that is not a skill set we are trained in or necessarily have. We are used to looking what happened in the past and anticipate what would happen in the future based on what we've seen in the past. But in the security side of things, you have to kind of be forward looking. So, there's a lot of interest in shaping the future of biodefense, and some interest in how new tools like AI and others will play a role. And I'm just curious, like given the specific experiences you've had, how do you view the issue of improving preparedness? And in particular, what priorities should we be looking at, maybe even the near term for this challenge of trying to enhance or at least maintain biodefense?
Yeah, thanks. And before I forget, I also want to put a pin in something to come back to, as we were just reflecting on that last question about preparedness overall. What struck me, especially for the students in the audience today, is how diverse of a career path you can have in this field. There's not just one way to go about a career in biodefense. So I want to come back to that, but to address the question of improving preparedness and what priorities, reflecting back on having been involved in response for the last 20-ish years and some of the policy deliberations. Across all of it.
Mhm.
I see, again, Beth mentioned this boom and bust cycle. That's absolutely something that keeps coming up time and time again. And the biggest challenge that I think we face as a country, not just as a government, is consistency in investment and attention, especially in the downturn years, right? Which is where we're heading right now. The investment and attention post-COVID is starting to change, and that landscape looks a little bit different than it has over the past 4 or 5 years. We've seen a huge influx of private sector investment and innovation in the defense and tech sectors when the Pentagon sent that customer signal that they were open to receiving it. Today, we have similar signals across multiple federal agencies that they are likewise open to investment, innovation, and biodefense. Unlike the last 20 years, however, the state of science has evolved to the point that we can actually make some real progress against our toughest challenges. And from my current perspective, where I focus is truly pathogen agnostic biosurveillance. And that's really what I'm excited about. So the three places where I'm seeing themes broadly emerge across the biothreat spectrum, that's natural, intentional, accidental, is first, integrated biosurveillance, the need to be able to detect any biological threat even earlier and characterize it even faster than we could have before. That means connecting clinical data, genomic sequencing, environmental monitoring, and global health information into a truly integrated system where we can have early warning. I'm really excited about some of the progress we're making there, especially in pathogen agnostic biosurveillance. The second is adaptable planning. To the last point about planning ahead of time, there's a saying in the government that no plan survives first impact with the enemy, but you have to start with a plan. So having something that can really quickly be tailored and adapted to the scenario that we're dealing with is a really important starting point. And lastly, it's all about the people and partnerships. I think it's really important for an effective response to have a well-connected workforce, a healthy workforce, and a response system that's regularly exercised so that we know what to do when we're presented with a different scenario.
So maybe I'll build off of that, and ask the next question. So when we think of all of the types of scenarios out there, it's myriad, right? There's the threat of biological warfare. There is threat of more of the kind of bioterrorism or biocrime where it's potentially smaller in terms of resourcing. There is the potential of an accidental release. There is the potential of a natural pandemic. There is the potential for international the threat to originate internationally, there is also the threat of insider action. And, we've seen, I won't say events, but certainly things that have raised concerns on all of those fronts. Certainly, recent headlines about finding, laboratories in California and Las Vegas. Obviously, those investigations are ongoing, not speculating about those specifically, but just to say it is quite daunting when you think about all of these scenarios. And so I guess the question is, if we have to develop the plans, how do we develop the plans that are appropriately encompassing of all of these, while also not being so high level that they don't actually support operational response and action, which have to be highly tailored, right? If you knew at the start of something that it was perpetuated by a human being, a thinking enemy, you would react differently than something that's just, spreading from Mother Nature, naturally. It's a really challenging thing. So anyway, you all have been in the trenches for a really long time. And what are your overall thoughts on that conundrum? And maybe Harshi, if you're willing to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, the incidents that you mentioned, the unauthorized lab, and those are ongoing investigations. This has essentially been the challenge of biology. In some ways, it's very simple, and it can be like a home cooked challenge, issue somewhere. It can be naturally arising. It can come from an international source. It can come because you travel somewhere and you got on a plane with somebody else that had something else. The origin spot is so diverse in the space that makes it extremely challenging. Also, the nature of the threat is extremely challenging, and what you need to do in response to it is very challenging. So the challenge that we have here, and I'm using this word way too many times, I'm aware of it, is the fact that you've got to anticipate threat from among all of these diverse sources. The threat itself can be completely a multitude of different things, known or unknown. You've got to figure out how to detect it in the environment or the source, but also diagnose it if it were to get into a human or animal carrier. You've got to then figure out how to prevent other people from getting it, either via vaccines or other physical defenses. You've got to develop countermeasures and therapies and ways to treat people that may have encountered it already. You have to figure out how to warn people about this so that you can prevent the risk of transmission. What are the law enforcement and customs and other processes that have to be implemented? And all of this has to be integrated. The data from all of this, which is multimodal data, has to be integrated. We have to figure out how to do decision making at the integration space of all of this. And each one of these branches is in the different branches of the government, run by different people, some technical, some administrative, some policy, some law enforcement. And so the challenge is extremely, extremely difficult. And that's why even the Biological Weapons Convention was ratified in 1975, and we still do not have a validation aspect to it, right? That itself is very hard. What do you look for? Do you look for a handful of threats, or do you look for unknown things? If it's unknown things, how do you look for it? Mm-hmm. So this is the challenge, but we've made a long progress and headway, and Kelly alluded to the approach to becoming agnostic. That's an evolution in how we think about the science of this. When we started off, we thought we need to identify anthrax and maybe a handful of other things. Now we realize we need to be able to identify unanticipated threats. And if we can actually develop an agnostic framework, that will allow us to prepare against any and all emerging threats quite effectively. It doesn't have to be perfect. That's the other thing that we need to be careful about. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be effective. And the example that I've used in my own work on agnostic biodefense for over 20 years now is the framework of how our immune response works. And I want to just talk to that for a second, because I think that gives a visual picture for people. Our body doesn't say, I'm going to develop one vaccine against one pathogen and I'm done, right? It says, I've got skin, I've got hair, I've got tears, I've got physical defenses, not different from masks and sanitizers we use during COVID-19, that prevents you from getting a pathogen in the first place. Now, if that were still to go in and we don't know exactly what's going on, I've got the innate immune system that's germline encoded that's evolutionarily conserved, that's going to recognize the entire gamut of pathogens that inhabit the earth, and even those that may not be in existence today, by looking at what's common between them and do my best to try to not only ward it off, but also trigger the adaptive response. Then the adaptive response comes in and says, let me develop the most specific diagnostic, the most specific therapeutic, the most specific memory cells, so you don't get chickenpox twice in your life. This architecture, this integration is happening. We have bits and pieces of this, but we need to bring it together, including how we prevent somebody from walking into our house when they're, like coughing or sneezing. That's the law enforcement piece. So all of this together into an architecture, and we've been trying, and learning, but the flexible, agile, and unpredictable nature of the threat, is what makes it challenging. So yeah, it's a field where I think that people will, at least technically, never be out of a job.
I totally agree with Harshi, and just maybe three quick points on things that fall into this integration bucket. Like, how can we take the framework that Harshi laid out and actually implement it? One, I just want to acknowledge a failure during the COVID-19 response. We did have plans. And no plan survives first attack. But one of the things that I think we really need to get better at is taking all of these capabilities, which are adapted for a much larger set of pathogens, and applying our frameworks to how we work more closely with states and cities, which have most of the authorities here in health, public health response, and emergency management. And that disconnect in our federated system was an area that I sort of very humbly can say didn't realize we would have as many challenges as we had in that regard. And there's lots of reasons for that, but I don't think we've solved those. And state and local public health are not increasing in budget right now; they are decreasing. They are getting whacked. So I think we need to focus on that integration. The second is being able to because we won't know necessarily at the beginning of an emerging outbreak where it comes from, and understanding the pattern of where it comes from and how it's spreading, using capacities that Kelly and Harshi both talked about, like when we get to the point of being able to do pathogen agnostic biosurveillance. We then need to be able to look at those patterns, bring together all the departments and agencies that have a role, do that fast. That is something that the U.S. government has been working on for a long time. It led to the creation of the office that I ran. It also led to the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence Function after 9/11 in general, and then for biosecurity later on more specifically. Those functions are not in place. And so I just do want to, not to deliver bad news, but I do want to say those functions which existed to form this coordinated capacity are diminished right now. And so I recently I signed on to a Center for Strategic and International Studies effort to look at the state of biopreparedness, very similar to the topic of this discussion. And one of the first things we recommended was to reinstate both of those functions. And then finally, Congress. Right now, we look across multiple departments and agencies in a very, very fragmented way. And I'm not proposing that we could necessarily change the entire appropriations process. But when I speak with congressional staffers, they do feel hampered in their ability to address all of the changing threats in a way that is useful across all of the departments and agencies that have to be involved. And so what that means is we just need more concerted effort to look at the gaps across all of the different authorities that we have and bring them together in a more coherent framework for the types of threats that we're facing now, which I think Harshi and Kelly have described how they're changing and how rapidly.
So Beth, you're getting into the next question I was going to ask, and I do want to ask it in terms of like, where are we now? But before I get to that, and then I also want to get to, I see some questions are starting to accumulate in the Q&A, and then we also got some questions submitted in advance. I'm just going to try to get to some of those as well. I just wanted to say though that the field, I think, I'm just putting my own editorial comments here, which is that the field has focused a lot on that kind of early detection, like trying to understand what's happening early. And I think that's appropriate. And I think there's some really exciting options there. I would just put it in a plea that I think we have done less thinking about responses along the way, and not just those early phases, but responses along the way, and including sort of expectation setting as to what level of response we are going to pursue. Obviously, the best thing is to prevent these events from happening in the first place. But I will tell you, I think when you talk to a lot of people about what happened in COVID, a lot of frustration stems from the fact that people maybe had been under the impression that if we stayed in our houses for those first few weeks, that we could get rid of this virus, that it would be gone. I would say many people, myself, didn't think that was a possibility, but nonetheless, that was an expectation. And then the expectation sort of changed, but people's understanding didn't change. Anyway, just to say, if I think we have to set clear expectations with, with what our response is aiming for at all phases, and not just in that early beginning, like we're trying to figure out what's going on, and then to be a little bit more dynamic to monitor the conditions and adapt the strategy as the conditions suggest, and to crucially make sure that is communicated in a way that's transparent and understood at all levels, including down at the community level. So that's just my one plug. But people, I'm sure, are tuning in and they want to know from these very seasoned veterans that we have here who have been in the trenches on this field, where are we with respect to the biodefense? Beth, you've already talked about your concerns. Obviously this is a long time coming in terms of, decades of work, and some of which has been recently undone, but where are we? And I'd love you all to kind of weigh in on where we are, not just today, but just looking forward, given how dynamic the threat space has been. Kelly, can I turn to you maybe?
Sure, I'll start. I think one of the other things that I've heard throughout the noon hour today is how diverse the group of folks that work on this issue are, right? We're not just talking about natural, accidental, and intentional. We're also talking about human, animal, plant, environmental health, right? This is a biodefense is a massive undertaking. There are lots of different departments and agencies at the federal level, state, local, city, emergency management. There are lots of players in here. So just foot stomp that this is a team sport. It's not just government, it's academia, it's the private sector, public health, animal health. It's a huge issue and a really complex one. And so there's not a single answer to govern them all, but rather a suite of things that we know how to do, right? As a community of practice, broadly speaking, we know what to do. As public health practitioners, we know how to address aspects of various different biological threats, whether we have a ready-made medical countermeasure or not. In my view, maintaining the focus and investment so that we're ready, regardless of whatever the next scenario is the most important thing we can prioritize at the moment. I think
And I just want to flag that because there was a question in there about career advice. And I'm tying your comment to that question, just to say that it does take a lot of different disciplines. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I see the question about words of wisdom for aspiring or early career biodefense professionals. Maybe I'll take a little bit of a sidebar here and say a personal story of my own was when I was applying to MPH programs, I was told that policy and public health is not a career field. Pick something else. And so I said, no, this is what I want to do. I want to marry these things and really work at the intersection of policy and infectious disease epidemiology. And so again, to something that I put a pin in a few minutes ago, just would advise anybody who is interested in doing the sorts of things that we work on, create your own career field, reach out to mentors, ask people how they've done it and what unique career path they've taken.
I'm going to nominate that for like terrible career advice awards. But
pick something else.
Harshi, what about you? Where do you think we are?
Where do we think? I want to just, again, do a system check, right? So even for 20 years ago when the anthrax attacks and stuff were happening, or even the annual flu cycle, we thought we had a handful of things that we needed to deal with. The world has changed dramatically in the last 25, 30 years. So globalization is more common, migration, we travel internationally a lot more, we have people come and forth, climate's changing. There's a lot of things that are happening across the world that has changed the face of, what we encounter and what type of biological threats are emerging and what we see. And so this has actually posed a challenge because, again, we have to be prepared for unanticipated threats. And so this realization that we need to build an agnostic biodefense framework has emerged, and people are beginning to work on it. But how do we catch everything, especially things that may not be in existence today? And that's the challenge that people are dealing with. There's also the crux of what's happening in the context of new critical and emerging technologies, and how are they changing the agility or the speed with which we can both create and respond to biological events and threats. And AI is talked about a lot in this context right now. And there's I can have a whole webinar around that and discuss that if needed to. But there's a lot of things changing is the point that I want to make. And so it's a new perspective, which Kelly alluded to before, that a lot of us are beginning to look at biodefense with. For me, I've been thinking about it agnostically from a long time. But there's a need to marry these careers, like Kelly said, because not only does the science need to catch up, not only does the perception need to catch up, but also the policy. Also, what we can do, the regulations. How does the FDA approve a new therapeutic? What if we say it's a diagnostic for everything? How do you even go about testing that? How do you get that validated? How do you get that out in the field? All of those things have to evolve, and so it's just shaking the way that we do the entire system quite a bit. And I find that generally, these kind of systems are a little reluctant to change just because of how complex it is in the regulatory landscape as well. And so for me personally, as well as my career, I've chosen that if I wanted my science to have an impact on real world application, I have to do some policy work, which I do outside as well. I have to be aware of what's going on in the implementation side. I have to think about the people that are actually doing this and not live in a silo. And by actually having more interconnection between these different units, we can probably make a much bigger impact, because each one of us is growing what we can do in our own areas. And by having that merged together more effectively, I think we can get to more effective solutions. Again, I want to stress, I don't think it'll ever be perfect in this field, but effective solutions faster.
Yeah, and Jen, I have to jump in on this and just say I am really worried about the state of U.S. biodefense, and I'll both talk about glass half full and glass half empty. So glass half full, I think Kelly and Harshi are right. We've never been in a position where we could realize what we've talked about in the field as real-time biosurveillance, the ability to actually find things almost, as quickly as possible. We've never been closer to achieving that than we are now. We've never been closer to achieving medical countermeasures on demand. You mentioned the 100 days mission. I commend CEPI's 3.0 strategy to all of our listeners. It's really ambitious. It's organized. It's looking at every pathogen, every viral family, and trying to take them off the table, and building the platforms and networks to get that done. At the same time, we have never been in a position in my career where it was more unclear who was on first in our departments and agencies for running a response. We've never been in a situation where there was more divide between states and among people in our country on this issue, including everything from simply banding together in a cohesive way to vaccine related policies. I've never seen our government walk away from a vaccine platform that we helped create. We did that with the Moderna H5 platform, and we don't have that in our arsenal. We won't have that in our arsenal for people. We might have it for the warfighter, but we don't have it for civilians right now. And those are really real things that will translate into a lack of preparedness. So we have work to do as a country, but we have a lot of opportunity to do that work. And there is a lot going on, and it is a very vibrant place, I think, for for anyone interested in going into this field, there is still a lot of activity in both the federal government, the state government, and non-governmental space, and a lot of impetus, I think, to get in and build the system we need inside and outside of government. Maybe lastly, on the career front, just building on what Harshi said about integrating technology, scientific professionals who are building the technology with the policy. I think we're in a really exciting place right now where we actually, in order to be safe and secure to prevent deliberate and accidental threats, we really do need to build biosecurity and biosafety as a technical field. We need to have that innovation built into the tools on the front end. There's a lot of really great work happening in many spaces, including Secure Bio, including at the national labs, including at CEPI. I think lots more work in this space can be done. And I look forward to working with people out there who are interested. Please feel free to get in touch to talk about career paths.
There are a bunch of really amazing questions, and I'm going to try my best to try to lump as many of them together into one question. But I do have to say, because none of you addressed it, but there's a probability question here that people have in mind, which is like, well, September 11th was now almost 25 years ago. Where are we in the state of the world relative to some of the scenarios that we worried about? I know nobody is in the position of making intelligence predictions of what's going to happen, but has the world gotten more secure or safer from these threats? Just kind of where are we? Because part of I think the challenge of this space is I think a lot of people want to say, well, yeah, but what's the likelihood? What's the likelihood? I will just say, I will chime in if somebody wants to say. I'm just saying I don't feel like the world is less amenable to concern.
The world is getting more chaotic by the day, Jen. We can just be, I can be honest about that.
Chaotic, more complex.
Chaos breeds lack of certainty. It also breeds a focus away from things that require a lot of organization and effort. And we just finished describing how much organization and effort we need to be ready for an emerging biological threat. And it also requires institutions that are global and people who are global and relationships that are global. I'm very worried about those right now. I think that's space where there's a lot of room for great improvement in terms of our biodefense posture.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll just say that, forget the human chaos across the world for a second and think about, the last 10 years or so, we've talked about, Zika, we've talked about chikungunya in the Americas, we've talked about monkeypox, we've talked about coronaviruses, multiple outbreaks, we've talked about H5N1. So the number of threats that we have, been discussing clearly indicates that in this ever-changing world, we obviously have to be, building more resilient arsenal. I mean, it's a given. Everything else apart, it's just all the more important that we develop this capability to protect and shield us, because ultimately everything we do as humans is to protect human life, right? It's the ultimate downright selfish thing that we are, and so and this is protecting human life.
And it's not just about preventing bad things from happening. It's also about some of the innovations to protect against human life, also have better humanity and reduce human suffering and improve wellness. So we've seen upsides certainly in terms of the technologies and the approaches that are happening. There's a bunch of questions around the changing funding environment, changing policy environment, questions around sort of more things falling to the states, but perhaps fewer resources to do that. And then the ultimate question is how? How do we do biodefense given these changes? Any insights on that? And then, yeah. We stunned them into silence. Anybody can chime in.
I was just trying to read some of the questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Go.
Yeah, I'm trying to lump a few of them into one question that are sort of
I'm
similar.
happy to take one piece just because it's something we've been spending a lot of time on lately, and a lot of people are. One of the things that I've seen a lot, where I've seen a ton of innovation lately in the health and the technical sector, has just been at the state and local level, and also just trying to find ways to help public health professionals and emergency responders manage increasing workload, decreasing support, but also, just an increasing, as you said, Harsheen, an increasing landscape of things to be concerned about. And so there is a lot of interest in how can tools like AI be used to help sift through guidance and how to help create protocols that are more adaptable. One of the things we saw that we've spent some time on here at the Pandemic Center during the COVID response is that there was tons of innovation at the state and local level, including with guidance that was coming from the federal level, where it was a framework, but it didn't quite apply to a specific situation, where Alaska was different from LA, was different from New York City. And at the end of the day, some of the challenges that we've seen, the political fragmentation and the personal fragmentation coming out of the COVID response that we've seen, has partially been, I think, about this feeling that people felt forced into a box in terms of how they responded, or that they were told what to do and didn't feel like it always, applied in their own community. So one question that's out there where there's a lot of innovation is how to apply guidance to specific local settings. And so we have an emerging project called Binder that tries to do that, to start thinking about that with a prototype in AI. There's a lot of great work on how to bring hospital data closer together. And Zink's work on PopHive is something I would commend. The Common Health Coalition is doing a ton of work in this space. So that's a lot of innovation on how can state and localities actually rise up in this moment and do more. We're also seeing states doing work with WHO. We saw California join GoARN. That's exciting and innovating. It's unfortunate that the US withdrew from the WHO, and I certainly do not support that action. But coming out of that action, we're also seeing states starting to innovate. And so I think watch this space, and looking forward to seeing where it goes.
And I just might issue a plea that, this isn't an only government only exercise, that it has to involve civil society, it has to involve private sector. I think that's one thing that we did sort of move away from, unfortunately. I mean, 20 some odd years ago, planning for a potential flu pandemic, there was a lot of effort to think about engaging the private sector as full partners in the planning, as well as full partners in the execution of responses. And I think we saw during COVID how letting some of that get cold was challenging. Some states, I think, did really kind of step in and then kind of innovate on the fly by having private sector partnerships. But it's something that we should kind of plan for and bake in to efforts in advance of any kind of need for them. Yeah.
I just want to add one small thing, which is,
Yeah,
if you're
please.
developing this architecture, let's not forget about the ability to scale any of the responses. What I mean is, if you develop a therapeutic, great, we got it at the lab. How do you make it for millions of people? If you can develop a diagnostic, great. What is our supply chain requirement during a time of emergency? Can we get the supplies that we need to make the diagnostic from other countries from where we procure it? If there's a pandemic going on, how do we make it in enough numbers? How do we get it to the people? That architecture is an integral part of this equation that we also need to pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah, our audience is also, I think, global, Jen. There's a ton of work going on in the field that Harshie mentioned, in the development finance world, with organizations at the regional level, Africa CDC and their new procurement platform, Gavi, the Global Fund. There's so much work right now going into how do we actually create the architecture we need to be able to surge and scale countermeasures like vaccines, test treatments, and personal protective equipment. That's another space where we need more economists who are interested in pandemic preparedness and response. I'm spending a lot of time learning about economics from many of them, but some of you out there may already have that skill and could really bring it to bear on this important problem.
I'm seeing in the questions, and this is a permutation of what we just answered, but a very pointed kind of question that I think we have to address, which is, hey, these are a lot of great ideas, but none of this is possible in the current administration. And you could tie it to the current administration, or you could tie it to just where we as a society are, given, disagreements that emerged during COVID, the spread of mis and disinformation, declining support for vaccines, cancellation of mRNA contracts that didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of, there are some portion of society that has the wrong, has their own views about it. So just like given that political context is what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to, given that political context, what can we do? And are there particular things, I mean, perhaps the state and local community-based approaches that perhaps offer the opportunity to pursue approaches that are aligned with state and local community values, and maybe that's a more tractable approach. Is that enough? Can we just roll it up to something that approximates national biodefense and then ultimately global biodefense? So just if anyone wants to chime in sort of on we have to acknowledge the political moment and not sound that we're naive to them.
Jen, I'm happy to jump in first and say, I mean, look, I agree that there are some things that are currently not possible. I also think that we don't have the luxury of time. I mean, you said, I think in your opening remarks that even for a naturally occurring pandemic, it's a coin flip. Whether we're going to have another pandemic that kills multiple millions of people in the next, couple of decades. And, when you add the accidental and deliberate risks on top of that, we just need to be ready. So that means that we have to figure out how to do some of this stuff, and I believe that unfortunately crisis breeds more urgency, and so I do think that we will get back to a place where the U.S. has the capability to produce countermeasures on demand. I also think there is a lot of work that's going into therapeutics. I'll leave Harshi, who's more of an expert in that space, to add on there, where we haven't actually focused enough on small molecules or antibodies in our biodefense arsenal. Vaccines are critical, but we often don't have them as early on as we need something. And so there's an opportunity to focus more work there. There's an opportunity to focus more work on personal protective equipment and stockpiles, both here and around the world, of things like elastomeric respirators, where we might have them last for longer and be available. And then testing. You know how I feel about testing. I know how you feel about testing, Jen. Like, we need diagnostics. We need better approaches. So there are things we can do. It's not everything, but we need to keep hammering on it. We can't let, the current moment keep us from moving forward. And there are a lot of opportunities in different departments and agencies to make a difference. But I agree with you. We can't be blind to the current moment where we aren't ready, and we need to do more to get there.
And I think there is no biodefense, no preparedness without community preparedness. And so, these always have to be rooted in the circumstances and values of communities. And that's really the starting point. I don't obviously think it ends there, but I think that is absolutely the starting point. And I know it's hard for communities to engage, but because we're talking about such broad scenarios, there are regular exercises, unfortunate exercises. There's natural hazards that communities face. There's, bad respiratory seasons. There's just a lot of opportunities for communities to think about how do we protect ourselves and our loved ones? How can we work together to reduce the suffering posed by these events, to make ourselves more resilient in the face of them? And those sort of locally led approaches, I think, are the natural hazards community has long pursued those. And I think it's taken a longer time to get into the public health and biodefense side. We only have a few minutes, but there's a few questions that are sort of like, how does biodefense relate to global health security? How does it relate to, and then there are other questions about sort of One Health and agricultural, and because we've talked about scenarios that sort of span these, I'm just your thoughts on this term and actions associated with this term versus actions associated with, broader terms, perhaps like global health security or One Health even. Any kind of thoughts on that from anybody who'd like to chime in?
I think One Health is a critical part of this equation, and a lot of the transmission that we've seen is obviously from zoonotic sources. So, if you really want to catch the outbreak left of home, I think tackling that space is going to be important. But to your point about what is happening in that space, there are definitely efforts that are going on in the science level, which is what I'm familiar with, that are actually tackling the synergies at the sequence level, or that sort of thing, to sort of cross this gap. But the implementation arm, given that each one of those is different, is is quite different. And there were some recent programs that I saw around understanding holistic, significant, One Health security architectures, which are quite exciting, and a couple of very interesting efforts. But there's a lot to be done in this field. We also need to figure out how to break some of the silos around, like what the USDA is tasked with versus what the CDC is tasked with versus what different organizations are tasked with, and how can we actually get conversations at the intersection space, which as investigators we work closely with all of those organizations, but at the implementation level, how do we break some of those, or create architectures to work across those, so that we can look at it more effectively?
Anything else to add there? If not, there's just a
Maybe
small.
just say quickly,
Great.
global health security is a term I've spent a lot of time on in my career. And I think global health security is basically, how are we building the capacities? How are countries around the world building those capacities? How is the US assisting with building those capacities to be ready for naturally occurring, deliberate, or accidental threats? So it's a very, when I say US biodefense, when I use the term biodefense, I am frequently talking about the US, even though it can certainly be applied globally. And global health security includes elements that are completely consistent with the framework of biodefense that we've been talking about. Usually, when the US talks about global health security, they're talking about the assistance that is being provided, but it has now become a term that is used to describe how ready is the world for any emerging biological threats. So just to hit that one. And then there are a bunch of great career website resources. There's one, if I don't have time to type it, I just want to mention the Horizon Institute for Public Service, which is an organization that is interested in AI, biosecurity, and the intersection of those two things. They have a really great emerging career resource on their website that goes through lots of different opportunities for fellowships, engagement programs, training programs in bio and biosecurity that I definitely recommend.
Yeah, there's lots of questions career related, which is, I have to say, to all you folks putting these career related questions, I am so incredibly heartened of your interest and
Yes,
willingness to get involved. And
join
like
us.
Kelly said, it takes a lot of different disciplines. So I hope everyone who's listening is thinking about this. And I think one of the things that we should do when we send out the recording of this is to maybe to send along some resources for people who are interested in careers in this space. It's really encouraging. It's really encouraging. Thank you all for that interest. Let
I
me
also
see. We
saw,
have.
I
Can I
saw,
Go
just
ahead.
make a
go ahead,
quick
Harsh, please.
plug for the DOE National Labs as an opportunity for
Yeah.
career development in this space, because we do multidisciplinary team science that cuts across a lot of perspectives, and definitely been amazing for me personally. So in many.
And Jen, I just feel like we should call out the question about Iran, because it's obviously a top of mind question nationally and globally. And I just think when we see an increasingly chaotic environment, we see opportunities for vulnerability and more concerns that there could be, even anti-American sentiment, more interest in WMD. So I do think when we look at a geopolitical situation like the one we have now, where there's a lot of uncertainty, it does make me more concerned, just generally about biodefense and being ready for anything that could come our way. So I think it is always the case that political instability is a challenge to watch side by side with biodefense, and also chemical defense and other parts of the WMD spectrum.
And I'll just add, I mean, people always ask me on this question of like, are we ready? And I'll just say, I think we have a fairly coarse proxy for readiness, and it's the fact that we are having measles outbreaks across the United States. Like, if you just ask me snapshot, how ready are we? And if I had very little time to consider the question, the fact that there are a concerning number of measles cases happening in the United States in 2026, with the availability of safe and effective vaccines, ample availability of safe and effective vaccines, the fact that we've had more than 1,000 cases in the first 2 months of 2026, to me, that is a bad proxy. I'm just going to say, I think thinking about what it takes to stop measles, it exercises a lot of the capacities that you would need for a range of other scenarios. And it really speaks to the challenge, including the challenge of people understanding the benefits and safety is associated with the vaccines that we have, because in many of the scenarios, the best thing to stop them would be to have a safe and effective vaccine. And the fact that we have that for measles and we're still seeing cases, I think leads me to worry quite a bit.
And there's also just a lot of disease circulating. When you have a lot of disease, it just brings home both Harshi's and Kelly's point that we need to be ready to detect any emerging threats, even in a landscape where we've got a lot of other things going on. So, agreed.
Well, not to end on the down note, but I do think I'm gonna channel the interest in this career space and the enthusiastic questions about potential careers. That's going to carry me through the weekend. But I do want to thank you all for participating today, particularly our panelists, Beth, Kelly, and Harshi, and to everyone who joined us today. This is a great conversation, really timely, I think, robust, and I appreciate your time and thoughtfulness. I'd also have to thank greatly our team at the Pandemic Center who helped put this event together: Bentley Holt, Michael Mitchell, Leah Lovegren, Amanda Kogan, Carly Gaska, Aaron Johnson, Andrea Ulig, and Alice Im. And to stay up to date on future sessions, you can use the QR code on the screen, which will take you to our link tree. And there you can sign up for our webinar mailing list, catch up on past recordings, and explore other resources like our weekly tracking report, which includes updates on topics like measles, flu, mpox, and other emerging global outbreaks. And we will have a recording of today's session, and it'll be available on our events page. And for anyone who registered, we'll be sending that out too. Please feel free to share that with others who you think would enjoy it. And you can follow us on our social media channels here for updates. And please do feel free to reach out with any questions or suggestions for future webinars. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I will say thank you. We're adjourned, and be safe, be healthy, and stay engaged.